Greetings, Ohio Valley. This is Dan Lima with OSU Extension from Belmont County.
And this is Karen Cox from WVU Extension in Ohio County. Thanks for tuning in to Extension Calling, your source for research-based information for the farm, garden, and home. Dan and I are going to be out of the studio for a while, and so we wanted to keep the show going by bringing back some previously recorded episodes. This is a show that was originally recorded in 2017, and we hope that you enjoy it.
We wanted to talk a little bit about deer. Deer have been rated the number one most dangerous animal in West Virginia for the high number or high dollar amount of property damage, as well as crop damage and even loss of life. Deer vehicle collisions are incredible here in West Virginia because we have this nice forest cover that runs right up to the edge of the road. So do watch out for deer on the roads this year and try to reduce your number from that statistical average.
Yeah, I don't think that's just in West Virginia either. I think that's probably most of the, I want to say most of the United States, honestly, except for maybe way out west.
And they just have bigger animals crossing the road out west. But just so you know, the deer issue is not new. While back in the 60s, we may have had very few deer and you weren't allowed to hunt deer because there were so few. By 1985, this press release was given out to a West Virginia University Extension Service. And I wanted to read it to you to let you know that nothing really has changed with the deer issue. And it says, West Virginia hunters are turning their thoughts towards bagging a deer. Perhaps no one wishes them more luck in that quest than the state's farmers, orchardists, and gardeners who are sustaining increasing losses because of deer feeding on their crops. Crop producers throughout West Virginia are reporting significant losses in corn, forages, small grains, tree fruits, Christmas trees, nurseries, small fruits, and vegetables. As the number of deer increases, their nutritional requirements and preferences can make them as destructive to these crops as insects or diseases. While the hunting season eases deer pressure somewhat, it does not eliminate the problem for growers. An integrated strategy of population management combined with either fencing or repellents is best, according to the West Virginia University Extension Committee on Deer Damage Control. And we'll skip down a little bit to say that growers experiencing damage can obtain permits from the DNR to remove nuisance deer. And for specific information, you need to contact your local DNR conservation officer.
And that all hasn't changed much anyway. Some of the current thoughts here are that the habitats that we have been changing in more modern times, but really, I don't even think those things are that different from 1985. Stuff like highway, shopping malls, housing developments have caused an increase in deer interaction between people and wildlife. And, and you can see that these animals are pretty well adapted. What do I want to say? Accustomed to maybe you can't go up to a deer and touch it, but those deer really don't spook until you get really close or until you give them a reason to run. So what that means is that the deer are pretty well acclimated to human activities, and especially in housing developments, you do see that a lot. And with a lot of the ordinances on feeding wildlife and interacting with wildlife, you just kind of leave them alone, and especially in the cities where you can't really shoot them, whether you're in season or especially out of season, obviously, but there's essentially no interaction, and these populations have increased a lot in the cities. So deer are herbivores, and they do enjoy the gardens, if not as much, maybe more than we do.
And deer are very opportunistic feeders. So deer have their preferences. They prefer the legumes and the forbs that are out there. However, they will eat anything. So even those deer-resistant plants, they call them resistant because nothing is deer-proof. Deer, we joke around that deer will eat anything, and the only way to keep deer out is to pave it, and then they'll come in and lick the salt off the pavement. So deer are very flexible in their habitat. They'd be just as happy living in your backyard backyard as in the woods. However, what happens with these human deer interactions when people start feeding deer, that gets all the deer to come together into a congregation, and that's how diseases get spread amongst the herd. And so when you feed deer because you want to watch them or because you think they're beautiful and you want to help them, well, unfortunately, what you're doing is you are actually hurting them, because you are gathering them together to a single location where they can then share diseases that they otherwise would not be exposed to.
And I'll tell you what, if you enjoy looking at deer, something as simple as putting in a fruit tree in your backyard and just letting it go is a way to attract these deer. They're going to come by and they're going to eat the fruits. Maybe, I guess technically you're not actively feeding them, Karen. I don't know if that would solve the problems or not, but there are people out there that have fruit trees and really don't manage them, and they just enjoy watching the deer eat them. So in terms of a congregation, all around a tree, I usually don't see that, because they kind of pass by and as they're foraging around, they'll eat some of the apples or whatever that's on the ground. But that is another way if you enjoy to look at deer. And it's not that people don't enjoy having deer there, but an overpopulation, as Karen was saying, can be a major problem. So because they are there, some of the different ways, some of the different methods that we have to control them are one would be something like a device or technique designed to scare the unwanted deer away. So there are scare tactics. Sometimes, usually, and probably what works the best are physical barriers to prevent entry. So now the deer aren't only going to get spooked, but they can't get over the barrier, can't get through the barrier that you've put up. Chemical repellents are another way to exclude deer. And there are the lethal measures. As in 1985, the Department of Natural Resources still regulates these things. And based on the crop damages that Karen was saying was, what was it? In West Virginia was the number one causing the most damage in terms of crop losses. And that's probably true in a lot of places. So there are lethal measures you can do through Ohio Department of Natural Resources or West Virginia Department of Natural Resources to get a permit to be able to kill them as a lethal measure. You got anything to add, Karen, before we start going into some examples?
Yeah, so just like with anything, the first step should happen before you plant your crop. So you really want to look at where you're planning on planting and evaluate what the deer pressure is in that area. Because when a deer has a feeding habit, it's very hard to change it. In fact, the saying goes that if you find one deer in your garden, you have to shoot that deer, because he'll go out and tell all his friends. And next thing you know, you'll have an entire herd of deer in your garden. So they do teach each other, especially a doe will teach her fawns where to find the best food. And once they establish that feeding pattern, it's very hard to break it.
Yeah, so they don't only run on instinct, but they can also learn from and adapt to the environment, which they have been, and that was something that was brought up early on. So let's talk about really simple things that people have done, and with simple solutions. Quick, simple solutions usually mean that the deer get over it pretty quickly also. So some scare tactics to keep the deer away. If you've ever seen people put streamers, flags, aluminum pie pans that will start reflecting the light, and it almost looks like something's moving because the wind will kind of hit the pie pan, for instance, and cause a little shimmer to happen. Those things will initially scare the deer because they'll look at that and they're not going to recognize it, and it's going to spook them for a while. But because they do learn, they'll figure out that, that's not really a big threat. So eventually, if that's your only tactic, then yeah, they're going to get used to it, and that won't work anymore. What some people have done is to move them around, maybe combine a few things. But that, again, even if you move them around and deer still... It might take a little bit longer to figure out what's going on, but eventually they will. There are noise mechanisms to scare away the deer, and one of them are the propane cannons that you can utilize. And it's basically just it's a cannon that's hooked up to a propane tank. You can actually put them on a timer, and it will just kind of shoot an explosion of propane. And you can make it so if you do have that on a timer, You can make it pretty random. Hopefully you won't do that in the middle of the night and wake up all your neighbors and everything trying to scare away the deer. But again, that depends on the situation that you're living in. If you're out where you really have no neighbors within a mile or long or more, then that might be a good tactic, even in the middle of the night. But that's probably not the best method for the city. So propane cannons are out there, and they do help. And that's another really good scare tactic to utilize. Other things are just your pets. The electric invisible fences are a great way that the deer don't understand that dog can come after them. So if you do have a pet that's outside, for instance, and you train that dog, it would probably have to be a dog. I don't think cats will do much to deer, but you train that dog to stay within that electric fence. Now you have the dog on your property, and the dog will probably want to chase after the deer, but will also keep from running away because it has that electric fence. But that's going to take some time. It's going to take some money in getting that electric fence set up. It's going to take a lot of teaching that dog to utilize the electric fence, and that takes some time in itself.
And a well-trained dog is really going to be one of your best protectors for any type of crop, be it livestock or vegetables. By training a dog on what is not supposed to be there and what is supposed to be there, that's a really great tool to have. And dogs can be trained not to run off. Dogs can be trained not to kill the neighbor's chickens. Dogs can be trained not to chase larger animals or to focus on one specific animal. But that does take training, and you do need to work with the dog from a very young age to get it to follow those types of instructions. So having an electric fence might not even be necessary if you can train the dog properly on how to protect your crop.
Yeah, and I was talking about those invisible electric fences.
I know.
Yeah. I mean, I know, because we're gonna go into other physical barriers, and electric fence might mean something completely different. But in this case, but you know what? Even just a standard fence that the dog can't jump over, but will be in the area that you want protected. So if the deer can get in, well, now there's the dog.
Right. Well, now keep in mind that deer are a prey species. And so when they're scared, a deer can run up to 36 miles an hour and can jump an 8-foot fence in a heartbeat. So, you got to watch that because, a fence that a deer can jump over is very different than a fence a dog can jump over. Dogs are more likely to go under the fence than they are over a fence.
Right. But what I was saying, Karen, is, all right. So let's go into the physical barriers for a second. Right. So in terms of a fence, now deer, they can jump very high, as Karen was saying. Minimum, I want to say permanent fence that will keep a deer out is 8 feet. That's minimum. Now, I don't know if it's easily cleared by a deer, Karen, maybe.
That's a panicked deer, okay? So a deer isn't going to jump an 8-foot jump just to get to some strawberries. A deer may jump 6 foot just to get to some strawberries, but it can't do 8 foot.
Okay. All right, yeah, so it will, an 8-foot permanent fence that the deer can't knock over. So 8 foot is minimum, obviously, and higher would be preferable. But an 8 foot should give you good protection against deer inclusion, exclusion. Well, I guess it would be exclusion from your crop. Now you're gonna have to. This can't be a real temporary fence, however, because the deer will push and they will try to knock it down. And I have seen deer knock down fences. They're just like, and so a temporary 8-foot fence really isn't going to do it with a deer. It would have to be a permanent fence. So you're probably looking at, in terms of a non-electrified vertical fence, some pretty high costs.
Yeah, a significant deer fence that's 8 to 10 feet tall and strong is definitely going to put you back a couple $1,000. But one of the things you can do to help improve the longevity of said fence is to put the fence up. Don't plant anything in there, but put a dog in there. The deer will learn that if they jump in that fence, they're getting chased by a dog, and they're not going to appreciate that. So they're going to avoid that fence in the future. So they are learning animals. You need to teach them what you want them to know. So you want them to associate that image of the fence as a dog area, not as a food area.
Right. I mean, and that could be something. You don't have to have the dog out there the whole time even. just periodically, if the dog's out there scaring away the deer, right? And then Karen was saying dawn and dusk are usually the high movement times for deer. So be careful when you're driving and just understand that dawn and dusk are usually when the deer are out looking for places to feed, foraging around. That's usually when the highest movement does occur. But that 8 to 10 foot vertical fence is going to be pretty expensive. And again, it has to be sturdy because you don't want the deer to knock it down. Now, using electricity does create a new barrier that the deer don't like. And it can also allow for a reduction in terms of the vertical size of that fence for exclusion. Something real simple is, and this is probably what I've seen around most, especially in home gardens, is a single strand electric fence with little strips of aluminum foil. And what people do with that is they put a thin layer of peanut butter or something that the deer will like to lick, and that aluminum foil, very good conductor of electricity, you got one wire, that deer gets shocked, and it learns that, I don't want to get near this wire. This really hurts. It's probably not even worth eating that pumpkin patch right there, even if those small pumpkins do look very delicious.
Yeah, and the reason the peanut butter fence is so effective, is more so effective than a regular electric fence, is because deer have hollow hair, which makes it very insulative. And they also have very small feet, so very little grounding. So when they run up against a regular electric fence, they really don't feel much. So you need to get them in a nice sensitive spot like a nose or a tongue. Now, again, for those of you animal lovers out there, this isn't really damaging the deer. It just gives them a nasty shock, which says go away. And so that is one of the more humane ways to remove a deer from your garden.
Right. And so we're talking about a wire that's about 30 inches from the ground, so just over 2 feet.
Now, for a smaller garden, you can actually have it down to 1 foot. So, it also depends on how big your garden is.
Yeah, so just single strand, and those, you can, you don't have to get a battery power or anything. Those things can be solar powered. So you don't have to have very high juice on that electric fence either. So it's very economical, and there's plenty of good kits out there that you can build that'll give you protection. And you know what? And if you have a big enough garden, economically speaking, it could pay for itself. Very simple fence, very portable. So when we talk about rotation, we're talking about growing crops and crop rotations and different ways to manage for pests, which we'll talk about later in a different show. It's a great way. It's a great tool that you can move around also and have that protection in various places, not just one.
All right, so since we're on the topic of fencing, though, I want to say that another fence you can use that maybe isn't as expensive as a 8 to 10 foot tall woven wire reinforced fence, and maybe is a little bit more than a single wire peanut butter fence, is the slanted tensile wire fence. So typically it has 5 to 7 strands. 7 strand is a little bit better, but it also depends on the amount of deer pressure you have in your area. So the trick is that deer have very poor depth perception. And so when they go to a fence, that's slanted, it looks a lot higher to them than it actually is. And while they could easily clear it, they don't understand that they can.
That's right. And even on the electrical side, there is such thing as a 3-wire 2-dimensional fence. And this involves the construction of 2 separate fences, one 38 inches inside the other. So as a single wire fence, this is an all successive fence, and they are electrified. So even though the deer don't like those 3-dimensional, so you're looking at 3 wires, 1 wire 15 inches from the ground, and then you're going to have that 38 inches where you have another fence, and then another wire that's 30 inches from the ground. And because it's a 3-hour fence, so you got one at 15, you got one on 38 inches back from it, that's 30, and then another one at 43 inches. Okay. All right. So 43 inches and 15 on one fence and 30 inches on another, and they're separated by 38 inches. Now, it's really important that the deer can't get in between those. So when the deer start seeing that, it really messes with them. And what's recommended even for that fence is electrified. So if the deer try to bump again, because the deer will try to knock them down too. Knocking things over is a pretty good tactic, and it would probably work if it wasn't juiced up. So the deer aren't going to try to jump it, but if you don't put the electricity there, they're going to try to knock it down. And like I said, it has to be a pretty sturdy fence if it's not going to be electrified. So when we talked about the 8-foot vertical, we're talking about probably a woven wire with 12-foot posts, well, 10 to 12 foot, probably 10-foot posts that are dug down about 2 feet. So that 8 foot's a minimum. Another type of fence is the Penn State 5-wire fence, and this is also electrified. This fence is about 58 inches high, and the bottom wire has to be 10 inches from the ground. Because the deer, even though Karen was saying they'll jump over things, they'll also try to go under things if they can't knock something down. So they're smart little boogers. But you want to have the lowest wire about 10 inches, and then you're going to have 4 wires that are 1 foot apart for a total of 58 inches on this the Penn State 5-wire fence. Very good fence. I guess that one can be permanent. It can be temporary, just depending on how you set it up, but it does need to be electrified to be effective. And again, that bottom wire, you don't want to go more than 10 inches, otherwise the deer will crawl under it. So when we talk about physical barriers, we're talking about either a very permanent, sturdy fence or a well-designed electric fence. So you were either going to put the peanut butter on that 1-wire fence so the deer learn if they lick it, they'll get shocked, or you're going to have something like a 58-inch fence that's electrified that the deer can't crawl under, but as they bump up against it, they do get shocked. So they're not going to try to knock it down too many times. And those are really those are probably the most popular types of physical exclusion methods that you can adopt for your garden or your operation, depending on what it is. Could be an orchard.
Yeah, and so you want to also consider that, the slanted electrified fence is going to be good for about up to 50 acres. Anything more than that, you really want to divide it up and put an extra fencing system in to divide the view to the deer. So 50 acres can be protected, and that's a lot of fencing. So another thing you need to consider when you're looking at the different types of fences is what is the economic loss that you are receiving. Yeah, okay, it may be annoying to lose the outer edge of your crop field, but is it the amount of damage, is it equal enough to put in a fence, to justify putting in a fence? And how much of a fence does it justify putting in? Granted, if you want to put any fence in, you want it to actually work. But you need to consider how much the fence is going to cost and compare that to how much crop loss you are actually receiving, and whether or not a couple extra kill permits from the DNR for nuisance deer would be better utilizing of your costs.
Now, when the deer pressure is light, some less expensive alternatives that you can do is we're talking about chemical repellents, so things that the deer smell that they don't like. And stuff like human hair with fragrant additives like cologne or aftershaves could be hung from trees that you don't want the deer around. Bars of soap have been used with various degrees of success. There's also smells of I want to say, what is it? The egg-based smell repellents. They don't like that egg smell. So these things they're not going to keep away the deer in heavy pressures, but they do work well for light pressures. And it's a very inexpensive way with variable results.
And I actually have a recipe in the office of the egg-based repellents. It's basically a combination of a couple different oils along with an egg and perhaps some red pepper or something like that, because they also don't like that red pepper taste. And so the trick, though, with these chemical repellents is they have to be on all the time. So if it rains, you have to get back out there and put it back on. And you also have to mix them up. So about every 2 weeks, you have to change that scent because, as we said earlier, these deer can learn and they will learn. And so while your neighbor may have great success with hanging some soap in their trees, it may not work for you. So deer are pretty strange creatures in that they're fickle, and sometimes what works one day might not work the next day. So you do have to keep moving things around. You have to change up your scent-based repellents, you have to change up your sound-based repellents, and you have to change up your sight-based repellents. The only thing you really don't need to change up is a physical barrier and a dog, because the dog's going to change itself around. But the other repellents you have to change up at least every 2 weeks. Yeah,
and just be careful with that kind of stuff, and make in terms of chemical repellents and capsaicin, especially if you're putting them on the produce itself. Like capsaicin is the hot pepper, great for ornamental plants that we don't eat, but you don't want to put that stuff on stuff you're either selling to the food market. You don't want to put egg yolks on stuff you're trying to sell at the farmer's market, etc. So just be aware to use certain things, and make sure you're being careful with that food safety aspect too.
Right. So if you have, say, your trap crop on the outside edge that you put it up for stink bugs or whatever, that would be the one you'd want to spray with this chemical, because that's not what you're harvesting and taking to market. So yeah, definitely check to make sure whatever repellent you're putting on the product is safe for the vegetable or fruit that you're selling it on. And that will be on the label.
That's right. And all right. So other things that you can do is stuff.
Give us a call at the office because we are out of time today. All right. Sorry to cut you off, Dan, but thanks for listening, everybody. And this is Karen Cox with West Virginia University Extension. And you can reach me at 304-234-3673.
All right, and this is Dan Lima with OSU Extension in Belmont County, and you can reach me at 740-695-1455.
Have a great day, everyone.
Thanks for listening to Extension Calling. This show is a collaboration between OSU Belmont County Extension Educator Dan Lima and WVU Ohio County Extension Agent Karen Cox. If you'd like a transcript of this show, contact us at the office. Also, let us know if you enjoy the show by ranking us on your podcast app.